David Eades, who's sitting next to me, is a journalist and previously a newsreader. David presented for various channels within the framework of the BBC, including the World Tonight, is that right?
World Tonight and Radio 4.
And Radio 4, wow, yeah, fantastic.
Clive, thank you very much indeed. Welcome everyone, happy birthday Hala. So let me just introduce the four. We'll start with David Ngome, who is going to talk to us about small holdings, agriculture and farming within the African framework. Dr. Jessica Hagen-Zanker will address one of the issues which I think we always see as the big issue, migration and immigration. So it's, again, let's get it from a more balanced perspective. Noni Muchiri, I could almost describe as a colleague. I've jumped out of the BBC and Noni is flying within the BBC, and we'll discuss the issues of environment and climate change and their impact both on Africa and indeed Africa's impact on those topics as well. But we're going to start with Ed. Ed is the director of the Africa Research Institute, Ed Paice, I should say, sorry, and is author of a number of books. But most pertinent, to be honest, Edward, for today is this, Youthquake, which I've had an opportunity to read. I've had it for a week or so. I did actually promise to Ed that I would finish this today in order to be completely ready for this conversation. Around about 10 o'clock I got asked for a game of golf, Ed, so I'm sorry. I'm most of the way through it, but it is a fascinating read. And I think if we can lean on you to start our consideration of Africa and of the impact of demography in particular, as Clive mentioned, with an address on really many of the findings, I think, from your book, that would be extremely helpful. So, ladies and gentlemen, Ed Paice.
Thank you, David, very much indeed. Could I just add my congratulations to René for an extraordinary lifetime's work, and also to the Hala Foundation, or Hala, on this, the occasion of its 20th anniversary, and to everything Louise has done to make it so successful. It is an achievement to be truly proud of. I'm also very grateful to be asked again by Hala, because I was fortunate enough to be at the great event in Nairobi in 2014 for the launch of the Hala Farmers app, which has been a remarkable success. And also at that event we gave the prizes for the first Hala Prize for Development Journalism, and a great occasion it was too. So I'm very glad to have been asked back, and also thankful to have been included in a panel of such distinguished experts in their respective fields. Now, I've been asked, as David has said, to speak about demography. And the subtitle to Youthquake is why African demography matters. So if we can just bear that in mind. Demography is generally overlooked as a topic altogether. You do see some stuff in media about India's just overtaken China, about aging populations and population shrinkage in Western and Far Eastern economies is another favourite topic. The breaking of the 8 billion barrier by the global population, which supposedly happened in November last year. But just as Clive Gilmore was saying in the beginning, it is quite astonishing how absent Africa is from this coverage. There are really very few exceptions. Declan Walsh, who's the Nairobi-based correspondent for the New York Times, did a really major spread on African youth and demography last year. But I would say that was the exception rather than the rule. That it is a topic that is really very little investigated. So I set out to write a handbook. I'm neither a demographic determinist or a catastrophist or a Panglossian. I just sought to present the data in hopefully a relatively readable way to people with an interest, because we should be interested and we need to be interested. When Adam Tooze, who's a professor of history at Columbia University, wrote a long review essay of Youthquake soon after it came out, he wrote, "Once you realize its scale, there is no global trend as dramatic today as the revolution in Africa's demography. In sheer quantitative terms, Africa's story increasingly drives world history." So I'd like that to be our start point. Now, while we're on scale as well, there is and this is to sort of get our minds going on the scale of what we're talking about. There is a map at the beginning of the book. You don't need to see it closely, but it shows the extent to which the standard Mercator map of the world distorts our impression of Africa. Because in reality, Africa is 1/5 of the world's landmass. You can fit, as the map shows, continental US, China, India, Europe and Japan inside Africa's borders with room to spare. So I'd just like to, as we talk about these very big numbers, I'd like an impression of space as well to be in the back of our minds. Well, now back to the numbers. Those few demographers who specialize in Africa refer to the greatest upheaval in history in demography. Between now and 2050, 2/3 of global population growth will be generated by African countries. It is the engine of global growth. This is driven by what I refer to in the book as the doubling dozen. There are 12 already populous countries whose populations will double by 2050. And they themselves will make up about 50% of Africa's overall growth. So 12 countries driving 50% of a number that is 2/3 of total global growth. Africa will also determine, and this is an extremely vexed issue, the point at which the global population peaks and starts to decline. And believe you me, if Africa is ever discussed, it's in the context of this fierce argument that goes on as to whether it's the 2080s, the 2090s, or 2100, and so forth. It has not been an explosion. Whenever Africa's demography is mentioned, you'll generally see the word explosion somewhere in the text. It's not an explosion, it's more like a mega surge, which commenced roughly in the middle of the last century. Between 1950 and 2050, the continent's population will have increased by a factor of 11. Now, to put that in context, in its century of major growth, India, between 1920 and 2020, its population expanded by a factor of 5, less than half. Asia's population between 1950 and 2050 expanding by a factor of 4. So what is happening in Africa is really quite remarkable. And as a result of this, the African population in total was less than 10% of the global population in 1950. In 2050, it will be 25%, 1/4. Conversely, Europe will have gone from being just over 20% to being about 7%. Projections on this sort of level, I must add, just in case there's anyone poo-pooing at the back, projections on populations over 3 decades are really quite accurate now. Beyond that, not so, but 3 decades is really treated by demographers as an area, at least in regional and continental totals, as having a high degree of certainty. So this means that Africa is the engine of growth up to 2050 and then beyond. Those projections to the end of the century are less reliable, but at the moment they state that Africa will be heading to something just short of 4 billion, at which point Africa will be 40% of the global population. These are huge global developments. In Kenya's case, just situating it, what's happened there, Kenya, if you remember, I was saying that Africa will have grown by a factor of 11 over a century. In that same century to 2050, Kenya's growth exceeds that, factor of 15. It's in the top 10. And the reason for that, by and large, is that at the end of the 1970s, the fertility rate in Kenya had reached 8 births per mother. 8. There's no country in Africa now, today, with a fertility rate that high. This was a cause of huge concern, not just to outsiders, but principally to the Kenyan government at the time. We won't go into what happened to deal with it, but Kenya's fertility rate is now below 4 births per mother. So 15 could have been higher. And if you want to know what 15 becomes, look at Niger, whose growth will be 25 times over the course of that century. That will be, almost without doubt, the continental leader. 25 times multiplication of population in the course of a century. Now this affects, as René would be able to describe better than I, every facet of a Kenyan's life. We've seen, I won't go into great detail, but we're probably all aware that there were enormous protests over the summer. They were described as Gen Z protests, and there were many causes of dissatisfaction for the young and the not so young that led to these protests and tragically to a number of deaths. But the result of that was that the Finance Bill 2023 was withdrawn and President Ruto had to dissolve the whole cabinet. So, there are very clear and obvious signs of of the role that demography is playing in everyday life. And the term youthquake is, funnily enough, now becoming common currency in the East African press. The ILO, the International Labour Organization, also warned in August that something had to be done to address the consequences of the youthquake. And just yesterday, the Chancellor of the University of Nairobi wrote in the papers, "We must harness the energy of Africa's youthquake." Now, youth, as has been referred to, is the defining factor of demography right across the continent. Again, rather like explosion, the term explosion is used wrongly. The term youth bulge is perhaps not exactly apposite, because the median age in all African countries has been low for decades and will continue for decades more. So there is no bulge yet in sight. Richard Sincotta, the distinguished political demographer, refers to this as chronic youthfulness. That's chronic as in the sense of set in. It will not shift for decades to come. As a result, 40% of the population, and of course it varies country by country, but overall 40% of the population is under the age of 15. The median age of all countries, almost all, outside North Africa, the median age is less than 20. In Niger, Mali, and the other Sahelian states, it's 16. That is the median age of the population. There are 1/3 of countries in the continent that have an under 18 majority in the population. Now, in the 2020s, this decade, 450 million children will be born across the continent. That's the equivalent of adding the entire population of the EU in a single decade. By 2050, 40% of children born worldwide will be African. And 1/3 of the world's total working age population, as Clive Gilmore was referring to, will be African. 1 in 3 people of working age. That's 15 to 64. Now, I've tried to explain in the book that the numbers themselves are actually inert. If that may not be the right word, but I think you'll know what I mean. In the context of René's work and Haller's strategy, what matters is the health and the education and the livelihoods or jobs of the individual. That is the challenge at hand. Professor Emmanuel Nadozi at the African Capacity Building Foundation wrote just the other day, youth unemployment in Africa is a much more serious problem than climate change. About 30 million young Africans, male and female, are reaching working age 15 every year. The working age population will expand in this decade from 750 million to over 1 billion. There's a need, a huge need, for, estimates vary, 15 to 18 million decent jobs. Means jobs with regular terms, legal protections, insurance and so forth. Across the whole continent, set that 15 to 18 with the 3 million that actually are created. And this means that for decades and decades to come, the vast majority need to find livelihoods that are outside formal employment situations. Now, at Africa Research Institute, we collaborated with the Institute of Economic Affairs a few years ago to produce How Kenya is Failing to Create Decent Jobs. Now, this in a sense is not it's not meant to be, the lead author was Kwame Owino, the director of the Institute of Economic Affairs in Nairobi, and this, rather like Youthquake, was simply to present the figures and therefore the scale of the challenge. And this is in a country with one of the most robust private sectors in the whole continent. So, you know, that tells us something. If anyone wants copies, there are copies of these. You just take a copy away or look on the website. And if they've all gone by the time you get there. This is why, at the moment, the current president is trying to broker migration deals. I don't know whether or not Jessica will be saying something about that, but it's an unusual development, this. You know, 20,000 Kenyan nurses offered to the UK, bus drivers offered to Germany. This is a controversial topic about which I won't say any more at this juncture, except that, you know, the issue is that unemployment is a key problem even if you're well qualified. So the education that is being provided, which is well above average for the continent, it is for so many young people simply not enough. Now, I feel I've gone on long enough. Sorry, I'll just end with another piece from Adam Tooze's review, which I hope encapsulates what I've been trying to say, which is that he wrote, how population evolves and how the continent's economies develop will affect everything people near and far assume about their lives today. It'll affect global food security, for example. David, I'm sure, will be touching on this. The fascinating thing is that, that maize, which is consumed by 80% of the population in Kenya and provides 30% of the calories, 80% of it is grown by smallholders. The smallholder is key to the future. It will also have a huge effect on migration, which Jessica will be talking about. And, you know, there are so many shapes of migration, and it's usually, as a fascinating event that she was leading in on Tuesday made clear, it's usually presented as a problem. But for so many Kenyans, mobility and migration is a solution. It's going to where you can find a livelihood. There was a fantastic piece of research done on the slum districts, informal settlements of Nairobi in 2012. It was the largest cross-sectional survey of all the informal settlements. And for me, one of the most astonishing things that came out of it was that the median duration of stay of the people living in these slums was 2 years. These are not homes for the future. This is a population that of necessity has to be on the move, looking for opportunity and adapting to circumstance. As far as environment and climate change is concerned, which Noni will be talking to us about, I'm sure that anyone who looked at the papers this year will be fully aware that El Nino this year, for example, the flooding was as severe as any year since 1950. And these are the impacts, the interplay of demography on environment and climate change are things that people are living with daily. It's global trade patterns, geopolitics, more esoterically perhaps, sport, fashion, music. All of these things are going to be fundamentally affected. So there you have it. African demography matters. And the last sentence is that we must not forget that it matters most of all to those that Adam Tooze referred to as the near, the people who are working with Renee, the beneficiaries of Hala. They are the first people to be experiencing how demography matters. Thank you.
Ed, thank you very much indeed. I mean, the statistics, a lot of what you've drawn on there is fascinating in itself. You play, if I could just ask for a little bit of quiet, that would be lovely, thank you. You play a very straight bat in terms of demography and what it means, and nonetheless you also raise some anxieties within me about the impact, so perhaps we'll come to that in due course. But let's just touch next on one of those issues you drew on. You referenced environment, you referenced climate change. Noni, this is your area for us. I just want to let everyone know Noni Muchiri is an award-winning Kenyan journalist who has a decade of experience in the field. She also hosts a very successful podcast called Africa Daily, which touches on actually all aspects of African life, I think it's fair to say, Noni. But your focus is going to be on climate change and the environment, so over to you.
Thank you. Hi everyone. I need some audience participation. I'm a storyteller. I don't have as many numbers.
They're relieved.
As was mentioned, I basically host and produce a podcast. It's called Africa Daily. It's a daily podcast, and we touch on what's happening around the continent, current affairs, news, politics, culture, arts, sports, you name it, we speak about it, right? So bringing this down to just the environment side is a bit hard for me, but I think we will start. I wanted to kind of know, and I want to ask you guys, how many languages do you think are spoken on the African continent? And you can yell at me.
200.
You better.
800.
It's
70.
It's in the thousands. It's in the thousands. So you can imagine. So it depends on who you're looking at. It can be from 1,500 to about 2,000. You got it right? Yeah, but he's been in Kenya. No, he has the notes underneath, So I mean, when it comes to in matters of environment, climate change, I think one of the biggest things that you also was touched in your book is language, right? If I asked you right now, I'm sure we're speaking in English here, but if I was to tell me how you say climate change in another language, who could put it up? I could. I'm sure you could. In Swahili? Mabadiliko ya hewa. Ya hali ya hewa. Okay. In French? You're on the panel. Good. Go on. A third language, anyone? Let's go. Points for you. So one of the things that I kind of note is by 2050, correct me if I'm wrong, is it 83 or 85% French speakers? So the global French speakers, about 85% will be from Africa or in Africa. So when you're thinking about practically, what does that mean? When you're trying to get people to understand the impact of what's happening with the environment, and you're speaking in a language that, you know, we'll speak here, but when you're talking to people on a grassroots level, which is what I do, how do you then connect with them at that level? How do you speak with people in their language, or maybe get people who speak in their language and translate in a way that everyone can communicate? For me, that's one of the biggest things that stood out when you think about population, when you think about the youth, when you think about how we communicate with each other, how we understand each other, and then how we can then take that communication to the next level to have some level of impact in what we do and maybe what we don't do. And again, it impacts religion, sports, you know, geopolitics, a lot of things that happen. So I want to give a bit of an example when it came to some of the stories that we do on the podcast. I encourage you all to listen to it. It's called BBC World Service Africa Daily, Spotify, everywhere. But what we do is we speak to people who are on the continent and learn about how they are adapting. For a lot of the people that we speak to, they wouldn't necessarily say, oh, I did this because of climate change. They'll say, I know that this happened, or I know, for example, let me give you a practical example. I know that when I see these certain bugs that come at this time, or when I know that when the wind switches from moving in this direction to moving to that direction, those are signs of drought coming. And when that happens, this is what we do. In Namibia, for example, recently, they've just started the government has implemented what they're trying to basically bring in the wildlife to consume, which I guess, you know, from another point of view can sound a bit like, what do you mean? They're going to eat the elephants? They're going to eat the elephants. And it's one of the things where culturally that happens. You know, there's a lot of nuances that happen in different countries, in different places around the continent. But it's one of the things where you know, as you get to know and you get to move across the continent, you get to understand why people do the things that they do, what's led them to being in that way. And those are the stories that we tell in a way to be able to kind of bridge the gap in a way and have people understand what's happening on the continent. So with Kenya, for example, what you mentioned with the Maandamano protests, we had, well, at the time I was here, the protest also happened outside the High Commission office here. And it was a situation that was a series of events that you know, basically what happened, let me start from the beginning, sorry. The government was trying to implement a finance bill, and the finance bill was touching on points, including climate change, that the youth and just general public, Gen Zs, everyone was not really agreeing on. So what happened is then they came out in numbers, and they came out and they protested, and what happened at the end was there was no, the finance bill was cancelled, and it was now put back into the parliament, and they're reassessing it and everything. One of the issues that it was in that bill was to do with the environment, was to do with cutting down trees, for example, in Kilifi, the baobab trees that are known in that area, cutting them down and trying to sell them off to other places. For example, SGR, when SGR, which is the standard gauge railway, was being dug up and the soil was being given to other places. There's a lot of things that happen with the environment that, you know, the youth really at some point were like, look, we don't have jobs, you don't have all this stuff, but at the same time, you're impacting our environment. And with the use of social media, with the use of things that are happening, the conversations were happening. And I think the most interesting part was that it was leaderless. So you couldn't necessarily say the opposition have mobilized the youth and then they're doing X, Y, Z, A, B, C. It was more through the use of social media, through the use of just, you know, people speaking to each other, that got into what was happening. And I think that's what, when you think of the youth in Africa, you think of the impact that they can make and the changes that they can make and the impact that they can have. Those are like more practical examples that happen. For me, when I think of that, that's very internal facing as well. As we expand and we look abroad, you look at like COP that's happening, COP's coming up. Recently we had one of the episodes where we spoke to a lady called Kulthum, and she's the lead negotiator for Africa, which is a bit of a tough job because how do you negotiate for 54 countries and have one voice? And she basically came on and told us that at the end of the day, you know, her job is to make sure that Africa, which, mind you, contributes, like we contribute 4% of global emissions to the world, but we're the hardest hit. Drought, famine, I think everyone's nodding, but like you can think of everything. But when you think of 4% of global emissions, for a continent that's hit the hardest, it's not really that fair, right? But how do you then go ahead, and then what do you do to mitigate that? Adaptation and mitigation. So she was telling us about things that happen within the continent, but then the conversations that they have abroad. And when they come to these summits, does Africa have a voice? Do we have a stance? Do we have a level of presence, or is it just pushed aside? So what her job is basically is to talk to people, speak to them, and let them negotiate for Africa. And she was telling us that basically it depends. One of the issues I think that is faced on the continent is that Africa, as well, at times, which I think you also touch on in your book, is that they don't have one unified voice. We have the African Union, but a lot of disagreements happen within that as well. But there's just a lot of things that would happen. So I think it's one of those areas where we kind of look more into. And then I think another thing I wanted to touch upon with the doubling, briefly with the doubling dozen. When you look at places like Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, there's a lot of coups that have been happening there from 2020 to 2023. In Burkina Faso, the leader is only 36 years old right now. Everyone under 36? I won't do that to you. But when you think of just like the youth, the impact that they have, it's a whole different. We could go into that for a lot. But I just think what they've done, especially, is like they're coming up with a new passport for themselves, and I think that also plays into how Africa relates within itself, and also how it relates overseas. Because then, how do we coordinate between East and West and North and South to have one unified voice to then fight these things that we want to kind of impact and change moving forward?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Noni, thank you very much indeed. Thank you. So let's move on to that issue of migration. Jessica Hagen-Zanker is Senior Research Fellow at the ODI, the Overseas Development Institute, and leads the Migration and Displacement Hub. And your focus, Jessica, very much on the effectiveness of migration policies and the drivers of migration. So over to you.
Great.
Thank you, Jessica.
Thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel. And yes, I work at ODI, which is a think tank. We look at a range of global issues, and we're no longer known as Overseas Development Institute. So I just wanted to let everyone know it's not a very good name. Migration, we've already heard about it many times, and migration is everywhere, as we know. It's a part of human life. It's probably been part of life for many of us in this room. It's existed, it's been around for as long as humanity existed, and it's also in the news every day. But despite its omnipresence, it's still very much misunderstood. So I wanted to share 5 surprising facts about migration today. Migration in Africa and also beyond. And I'm going to draw mainly on a research project we worked on for 6 years called MIGNEX, where we did a survey with 13,000 young adults in 25 communities across 10 countries in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. The first fact is that not everyone wants to migrate. From the political discourse and media representations of migration, we get the sense that the vast majority of young people in Africa and also other places are trying to come to Europe every day. And that's really far from reality. Migration aspirations, which is the conviction that leaving is better than staying, really vary greatly amongst communities. In our survey, we found that most people don't have any migration aspirations, and on average, only about 1 in 5 are really resolute about wanting to leave. And of these people, most aren't set on wanting to migrate internationally or internally. It's all about migration being a potential opportunity that might present itself to them. And for many, migration means internal migration. So the survey you talked about, Ed, of people who had stayed there for 2.5 years in those slums, these were people who migrated internally. And this kind of short distance and temporary migration is much more common than the long distance travels across the Mediterranean or across the Channel that we always hear about. The second fact is that there's not one driver for migration. Migration aspirations are shaped by many factors and also all at once. People migrate for many reasons, for safety, for work, for education, for their family, or maybe just for adventure. And even though politicians like to divide migrants into neat categories like this is a refugee and that's an economic migrant, the fact is that reality doesn't really, the reality is very messy, and most people can fit into several categories at once. And migration aspirations are shaped by many different aspects of people's lives, by their personal characteristics, by their family situation, but also by their communities and their countries. And these different factors can cancel each other out, and I'll give you a concrete example. So for example, we found that people living in an environment with high levels of environmental hazards and stresses, so for example droughts, are 9% more likely to want to leave. But at the same time, we also found that people with high levels of satisfaction with their life were 13% less likely to want to leave. So that effect then immediately cancels out the effect of the drought, for example. We also found that most determinants work in divergent ways, that they increase migration in some communities, but they actually decrease it in other communities. So there's no easy answer on why people migrate and also who migrates. My third fact is that making people better off leads to more migration. We found that poorer people and people who live in poorer areas are 40% less likely to want to migrate. So that's actually a really large effect. Poorer people might feel more constrained in terms of their aspirations, but they're also less likely to be able to migrate because they just don't have the funds to pay for migration. We also found that people with lower levels of education are also less likely to want to migrate. So that means reducing poverty and raising education levels might actually increase desires to migrate because it gives people the means to do so and it broadens their horizons. We also see this on a country level where the relationship between migration and development takes the form of an inverse U. So as countries become more developed, out-migration from that country increases. And then from a certain level of development, it's usually between 6 to, I think, 10,000 USD per capita, migration starts decreasing again. My fourth fact is that many policies to lower migration actually increase it. Migration policy making, unfortunately, doesn't really rely on facts. It often relies on intuition and guesswork. And one popular approach is to tackle the root causes of migration, so to improve people's lives in their countries of origin so that they're less likely to need or want to migrate in the first place. So that approach proposes giving aid to poorer countries to, for example, help create local jobs or to improve schools or health systems. And policymakers assume that giving us money will lead to better development and that addressing these issues will reduce people's desire to migrate. But these assumptions just don't hold. For instance, going back to our poverty example, reducing poverty and making people a bit better off actually means that migration might go up. Other drivers, such as, for example, scarce livelihoods can be addressed, but it can take generations before we can see real change. And also these interventions can be extremely costly. For example, the World Bank looked at a potential investment of £8 million in Tunisia, which would create at most 300 jobs in the trade and construction sector. So that's at the cost of 24,000 per job. So that's just not a very effective investment to stop 300 people from coming to Europe. So a really important takeaway is that development aid is really important in its own right, and it shouldn't be linked to influencing migration. And then finally, we also hear a lot about return migration, and politicians also talk a lot about deporting people and wanting to send them back to their own countries. And again, often that's framed in terms of, but that's also really good for these countries of origin. And we found that return migration can sometimes foster development, but only under certain circumstances. So return migration can have positive well-being outcomes for the return migrants, but also their families and communities, because return migrants often return with financial capital or new skills, knowledge, and resources. But it doesn't always have these effects. It depends on their conditions in the communities they return to. Often out-migration releases pressure on the local labor market, and then in turn the return can represent a strain on that labor market. And we also found that when returns are forced, so deportations, they can represent a risk to development. And forced returns can have a range of harmful effects on migrants' home communities, whereas when return migration wasn't forced, it was connected to lower poverty and higher wealth. And you might ask, why is that? It can be because deportees are traumatized and they're not able to contribute to their communities. In fact, they probably need more support than they can give. And also because they might not come back with these resources, which make their home communities better off. So those were, I'm going to leave it here. I just wanted to point out, I brought some reports which show our research in a bit more detail, so feel free to take them with you. And also, come and chat to me afterwards if you'd like to hear more about ODI's migration and displacement work. Thank
Jessica,
you.
thank you very much indeed. Thank you. That's 5 very challenging remarks there, which we might be able to draw on. Let's look at agriculture, at farming. I think, Edward, you write quite a bit about the capacity of Africa in terms of agriculture as well, and this is an area where David Ngome is truly an expert. He's also a HALA trustee and development communications consultant at the International Fertiliser Development Centre. You've got expertise in farming innovations across goodness knows how many countries, teens. 15, 20 countries. So we'd love to hear a bit about that. And that's working for the International Institute of Tropical Agriculture, the Alliance for Green Revolution in Africa, and the World Agroforestry Centre. So David, over to you. Thank you.
It's a bit intimidating to listen to all those voices and be the last person to speak. So my voice is naturally a bit lower. If I don't shout enough, you can tell me to raise my voice. So the smallholder farmer academically is described as someone who's growing their crop within less than 2.5 hectares of land. And you know, when you talk about them academically, it's like a story that is far removed from your existence. It doesn't really feel as part of you. But I've been lucky enough for the last, they need a mic.
Yeah, need a mic.
Yeah. It's genes, genetic.
It's okay.
Yeah, maybe you should have a conversation with my parents. They have 10 voices. So, I was saying, when you talk about smallholder farmers, it's most of the time it's something so removed from you. You cannot really relate to it. I was born and raised in Africa, in Kenya, but still, I didn't have that experience myself. But over the last 12 odd years I've been working with smallholder farmers, I've been very lucky to spend evenings and daytimes with these farmers at their very basic existence. And I think it's both humbling and encouraging to see what they do, what they go through. So everything that Edward, Noni, and Jess has mentioned affects farmers. So if you ask me about what a smallholder farmer is, I will not go the academic way and tell you about the 2.5 hectare. It's someone who is so important to Africa's food security. because, like Ed said earlier, 80% of African food production is from smallholder farmers. And despite the migration and climate change, this is going to be the trend for a while. It's going to be maybe 10, 20 years to come. Food for most of the African continent, not even just the African continent, but the global south, as South America, Asia, is produced by smallholder farmers. So it's something that is a mainstay. So how important are they? Why should we think about smallholder farmers? Because this is ultimately the heartbeat of the population that we are talking about. And this population, it's rural-based, and so this is why, at the same time, it's also young. So this is quickly tied together. Both the smallholder farming is also the heartbeat of the youth that Edward is talking about. So this is both the production and the population age group. So that's why when you talk about smallholder farm, how important they are, you have to think about the young people as well. And then the last effect is, where are these young people going once they have become of age, they have finished school, they're looking for jobs, they're migrating. So when you look at it, it's a cyclic problem. When we are thinking about solutions, most of the times, this is my opinion, most of the time, development organizations, donors, they pick one problem. They look at migration, they look at access to markets, they look at investments, or they look at access to inputs. But ultimately, and this is what HALA is doing actually, ultimately you have to look at the whole giant problem as a single thing. If you solve migration issues, you might not really touch on climate change. If you solve access to inputs, you might not really touch on investment. So if you look at a smallholder farmer, you want to not really solve this problem, but you want to help them a little bit to advance, you must come up with something that is a whole package. So HALA, what it's doing is very beautiful. It's at a very small scale. It's supposed to grow bigger because it's looking at farmer learning. So what is farmer one doing that can help the other one? At the same time, Africa has a problem with, as a continent, by the way, has a problem with extension services. So farmers just knowing what time to plant, what to plant, how to plant, and when, things like this. So HALA provides advisory services. And I think the current initiative is looking at how to invest, how to come up with microfinance services that farmers have a little bit of cash to invest in their farms. So it's a complete circle. So if you look at this as a scaled up initiative, it will solve a lot of problems. It will be a foundation for a lot of solutions. But I want to bring in the question of young people to this conversation. How important are they? So if we say smallholder farmers are going to be producing food for Africa for the next half a century, as we figure out the solution to all the problems mentioned. Ed said in his book, he mentioned something about we need to harness the energy and the potential of the young people to use it for whatever sector we want. But imagine that made effective and efficient in smallholder farming. That means at a very small scale, we have food that is enough to feed more families than it is doing now. So it's an imperative thing that we must make this sector vibrant, attractive, and convenient for young people as well. And when you think about a smallholder farmer, it's not really enticing because they are very vulnerable to shocks. One or two extra weeks of drought, that means there is no food next year. We had a meeting on Monday with the team of the panelists. I was in Kitale, that's where I come from, and there had been some extra rain for 2 weeks. That means all the maize that was about to be harvested is going bad because it will be wet and it will rot in the farms. And for sure, I can tell that next year a very good population of farmers will go without food. So they are very vulnerable to shocks. So anything that can solve those sort of problems, for example, if you have early warning systems, so they can know they need to delay their planting or plant early, these kind of things. So a lot of work is going into this research, and my critique has always been that it is very isolated. There's a big elephant, but everybody is touching different parts. But in our gathering today, because I know all of us now have a single mind of supporting what Hala is doing is, if you think about it, whatever space you are in, of combining solutions that touch all the cyclic vulture that can affect smallholder farm. That would be the best basis of looking at issues. And this might not solve the problems that smallholder farmers have as a whole, but it is a foundation on which most solutions for smallholder farming, food security, income for what we call resource disadvantaged families will grow on. So it's a very good thing to think about how to make a full circle solution that touches on every sector or the value chain that supports all these things. Thank you.
Dave, thank you. Thank you very much. I love the elephant analogy of just poking various little spots. Well, I think we've poked a few spots of the elephant to create a bit more of a holistic view on, for me, what I see are the challenges. I mean, my goodness, the challenges are massive. I'm going to look at Louise for a moment, because I know we're running slightly over, and I expect you're all parched and itching to get another drink. But I did also say there's a chance for a few questions. Is that okay? Can we? Great, excellent. We've got to go ahead. So, if anyone would like to make raise a question. We've already got one here. Just see a show of hands, so I've got some idea. Well, oh yeah, another one over here. Please, go ahead. Just go.
I'm loud enough.
Oh, here we go.
So I guess what we hear from the panel is that there's a Youthquake, and we've heard a lot of the challenges, but what's the exciting thing about the Youthquake? Like, if we think about what Professor Paice says, is that the Youthquake is not, it's not noticed enough, it's not seen, and what is that makes countries seen? Well, Samsung is tech, or new solutions to climate change. So what's going to make Africa seen? Is it tech and solutions to climate change? And is that what's going to make the African youth seen in the future decade?
Great question. Do you want to start, Ed?
One of the others.
No, you start, Ed, and we'll bring one of the others in.
What will become known as Africa's solutions? Is this primarily?
Yeah, what's the innovation that's coming from the youth? We have this
okay.
capital, right?
Yeah,
we have this Youthquake.
Fine. Yeah,
what are
thanks.
they going to do? It's
Well,
an exciting time.
There are, I mean, I'd hate you to leave thinking that in any sense people are being supine, because they're not. There are now vibrant tech centres, Nairobi being one of them, but also in Nigeria. The outside world in tech is getting the hang of the idea that, if they take some sort of thing in, and because it works in North Carolina, that doesn't mean it works in Kenya. So there is now a growing respect for an already large and burgeoning tech development sector across all sectors, whether it's be it in innovation for farming, early warning for climate hits, or whatever. So I would say, because I won't go on further, that one of the things that I see every day across the desk is some exciting new app or tech development that is being developed in one of the tech hubs on the continent. And you have a population, the young are more educated than they've ever been before by a country mile. And they also don't mean to take all this stuff that's being thrown at them that we've been talking about lying down. And so not only do they protest, and with increasing sophistication, and tech itself plays a very large role in the way these protests are organised and coordinated. So I would, if I had to pick one, because I won't go on any further, it would be tech developments are earning the respect of the big global players. And if they want to go in, they're going to partner now, more than even 3 or 4 years ago.
Noni, you're speaking to people all the time from all sectors. So
I mean, even just to add to the tech conversation, I don't know if you know Cash App, Zelle, all of those like mobile money transferring things. It started in Kenya. M-Pesa. Pesa is the Swahili word for money. M-Pesa is a way that you can send money to people, and small scale, large scale, there's a limit, but you can hit the limit, you can send it to me, I'll tell you what the limit is. But basically, one of those things that happened in Kenya, and then what happens is, Mark Zuckerberg came to Kenya, and it kind of took off in that sense. And what happens a lot of the time is the credit doesn't come back to the original source when it's from Africa. So I think there's a lot of avenues, there's a lot of places, but it's also just looking back and saying, okay, cool, Cash App, Zelle, but did you know about M-Pesa? Again, is it because it's called M-Pesa and not easy money? Or something in English, for example, back to the language conversation. So tech is definitely a huge, huge factor in that. I just wanted to add to that, yeah.
Thank you. Yes, okay. Yeah.
And then I just wanted to add that the Youthquake also really represents a very important opportunity for Western countries, because they have a very different demographic problem, and they already have huge labor shortages in many sectors. For example, I have a colleague who's been looking at how European countries are going to hit net zero targets. And there's lots of very specific things they need to do in terms of, for example, housing and things like that. And they just don't have the skilled labor to conduct those transformations that are needed. And there's no way countries will be able to hit those targets without more migration. So those schemes those deals which the Kenyan government is already brokering in terms of nurses and bus drivers, we're going to see those more and more for a range of different sectors, because Western countries are just going to have to rely on labor from elsewhere.
Jessica, thank you very much.
I've got two questions. The second question is I just want to ask Ed about demographic dividend. So that's the second question, because that would seem it's right for demographic dividend, but what you're suggesting it ain't happening. The main question for the panel is there was an article in The Economist this week that said that global poverty has increased, and the rise of sort of wealth within the global south, for want of a better term, has decreased in recent years, and their analysis is that that's due to a pullback from globalization and neoliberal policies, with the view that more protectionism's coming in, so that the whole idea of globalization has reduced. And there they say what should happen is that there should be more structural reform across places like Africa, and let the money flow, let the big boys come in, and then everybody gets richer, and the tide will rise, and everybody's happy. Or if other people would say, well, actually no, it's nothing to do with that, because that just makes the rich get richer, and the poor get poorer. And so really what should happen is sensible interventions and sensible distribution of wealth. I just wonder what the panelists thought about that.
Thank you very much. Who'd like to take that on the panel? Ed, question 2. Let's start with that.
Well, you're correct. Question 2 I can do quickly. Yeah, it's a catchphrase, demographic dividend. I mean, it emerged from very interesting econometric research, the end of 1990s, guys called Bloom and Williamson. Now, the very short answer to this is that they took East Asia and analysed the markets there and showed that there was a percentage of the economic miracle that you could assign specifically to the population structure. First of all, I'd say, these theories never translate very well anywhere else. And generally, African presidents in particular are guilty of throwing around the demographic dividend term, meaning I've got a lot of young people. but I mean that's a fatal way to look at it. You get a dividend, or the essence of getting a dividend from a large section of your population being youthful, or specifically in working age actually, so it's broadly just youth, is that they have to be healthy, they have to be well educated, and there have to be jobs for them. That's why I mentioned those three without getting on to the demographic dividend. So the numbers alone, as I also mentioned, are inert. Your population becomes more productive, or even ultra productive, if you provide those ingredients. And at the moment in Africa, there's a whole industry studying the demographic dividend. But I mean, even at a push, you don't see anyone getting a dividend until 2060 or something. I mean, and then it's totally, it's pie in the sky, because you're having to forecast for 25, 35 years what the education budget is, what the health budget is, what the tertiary education sector looks like, and all these things that make all of us lucky ones hopefully productive. Of course there'll be more productive people. I'm an optimist, but,
Okay. Yeah, we'll
that's
leave it
that.
on that.
Yeah,
Thank you very
sure.
much. Thank you. Have you had a thought? Do you have a view? Quite a political question.
Yeah. So the problem about globalization and having the big boys coming in to solve these problems, I don't think it is like I said earlier, it's not a unified single solution perspective to it, but I think from what I've seen in different sectors as well, especially in agriculture where I have a bit of knowledge, problems are location specific. So solutions that could work in England, for example, wouldn't work in Kenya. And it could work in Kenya, it will never work in Tanzania. It could work within some western parts of Western Kenya. So there has to be some form of collaborative partnership that looks at problems in context. And then finally, when Kiara asked about what is exciting about the youth in Africa, is they are not also sleeping. They're quite innovative. They are thinking really, really quickly. And just give an example, there's on TikTok, this is the most popular app I've seen. There's a young man from a small town in Kenya called Muranga. He's out of Nairobi. And he does short videos about how to fix a car in a local language, in the way he understands. He doesn't speak good English, doesn't speak good Swahili either. But he explains how you can look after your car. And he gets millions of views from Kenyans. And they ask back questions and they talk. So this, when you translate, there's another guy growing goat somewhere. So this is like they're already working on this, and if it can solve, because they are questions that I will ask you, does it give me profits? Does it offer me a future? Will I have a guaranteed market? If they get this information, they work best on their problem in that context, and I've seen it. It's a very good and growing trend. So this is a bit exciting because they're using access to information in a way that we've never seen before.
Well, that's a very strong positivist message to bring this to a close. Thank you for also staying on your feet for the duration. If I worked at the BBC, I'd be sacked by now for running over time. So fortunately, I don't anymore. But can I just ask you to put your hands together again, please, for our marvellous panel. One, just before I hand over to Chloe, one tiny little thing. Ed's book, Youthquake, I recommend it. Certainly the first 2/3, haven't quite finished it. But Ed is signing the book here for you, and all proceeds going to Haller. So that'll be round about there as well. Thank you.